Hey, I'm Serenity and this is my channel, and today we're joined here by Ginger. We're at a different angle today. I just didn't like how the last video felt like you were right here with me. Today we're going to be discussing one of the possibly hilarious cases, in my opinion, that I've ever covered. I say that because no one really got hurt, and I like silly crimes like this. Obviously, that's why this series exists. So let's get into it. Ludicrous Atrocities is a series on my channel where I scourge the internet to find the most mind-boggling crimes ever committed. But the thing these crimes have in common is that they are pretty much mostly non-violent and possibly the funniest crimes you will ever hear. They are much more lighthearted to digest. Basically, I know for a lot of the true crime genre, the crimes committed are really hard to stomach. So most of the time you're hearing about the most depraved thing that can ever happen to a human being, and usually an unsuspecting victim. This series is for those of you who want to get into true crime but really can't stand violent crimes. So I've gathered a list of non-violent crimes that are just kind of humorous and like, how did that happen? I would link them to maybe more like white collar crime, maybe blue collar crimes. Something obviously illegal happened here because it's a crime. But for the most part, in most of these stories, no one is harmed. At least not physically, but most of the time financially they are. It's supposed to be a little bit more lighthearted, telling you a crime that hopefully you learn some sort of history about when you finish the video, and then you walk away without that heavy case on your mind, and maybe some like weird topic to bring up during a conversation with friends. So today we are going to be talking about something that I find hilarious. I love this so much, and that is the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist, which resulted in $18 million of the gooey syrup being stolen by a group of insiders. So buckle up, grab a blanket, grab a snack, grab a drink. Nova has joined us, and let's get into it. I do need to say that this case is based in Quebec, Canada, in specific Montreal, Quebec, Canada, which is the French Province part of Canada. I may actively at this moment be learning French, but I am nowhere near fluent, and I probably won't be till the rest of the year. So the names in this case I might be mispronouncing because they are very French. Anyways, I will be doing my best to pronounce them correctly, but sometimes I might say them the American way, sometimes I'm going to say them the French way, sometimes I'm just going to butcher them. Please give me grace, I am still dyslexic, and my dyslexia usually shows through my pronunciation of things. Also, only take a shot of water every time I say maple syrup in this video, okay? Or else you are going to be blackout drunk. Hint, I say it 40 times. So, also the last thing you need to know is all the monetary amounts I'm going to be saying in this video are in Canadian dollars, minus the next sentence that I'm about to say, which is US dollars. But going forward after this, everything else. So I don't personally like traditional pancake syrup. Imitation, I don't. And I only use maple syrup personally. Yet my favorite brand, right here, Rumamc, is $20 a bottle. This will last me maybe 3 to 5 months, sometimes only 1 to 2. So at least every year I'm spending $40 in maple syrup alone. Now I don't know about you, but that's a tank of gas. So in Canada, maple syrup is considered a delicacy. It is the country's biggest export, but boy is it really expensive, as you can guess by this little more than a cup of syrup being $20. Canadians love maple syrup so freaking much that it is the leaf on their money, it is on their flag. They have a hockey team called the Toronto Maple Leafs named after maple syrup, and apparently in some cases I've heard some reports that maple syrup is the smell of the money, like their money smells like maple syrup, and apparently their money's waterproof, which is really cool because American money, once you tear it, it's done. So 71 to 85% of the world's maple syrup, all 8 billion of us, comes from Canada, and 91% of that syrup is produced in Quebec alone. Maple syrup is a natural substance, sort of like honey, and it is made from the sap of maple trees. In cold climates, the trees store the starch in their trunks and roots before the winter, kind of like hibernating. And then the starch is converted to sugar that rises in the sap in late winter, early spring, so February to April. There even is a color grading scale for maple syrup, which I didn't even know about. I think this is fascinating. Maple syrup is categorized into 4 subcategories: gold, amber, dark, and very dark. And it just determines the type of flavor. The lighter flavor you're gonna have, and the darker, the richer flavor you're gonna have. Now, one thing we need to get clear is that the maple syrup industry is extremely lucrative. There is so much money in this industry that there are billionaires who made their fortune over maple syrup alone. 1 barrel of the substance in 2012, which is when this case took place, was valued at $1,800, which equates to about $32 a gallon. That's a lot. In 2020, Canadian producers exported over 61 million kilograms of maple product, which is valued at $515 million. To put that in perspective, 1 barrel of oil, you know, like petrol that goes in your car for gas, in 2012 was valued at only $112. The price of maple syrup has only gone up. For reference, as I was researching this case, I found out that my favorite maple syrup brand here says Vermont, but they get the syrup from Canada, they package it in Vermont, and then they ship it to Whole Foods all over the country. This is directly actually imported from Canada, okay? When I started buying this brand in 2019, it was $13 a bottle. But just last month when I purchased this one, I paid $18 plus tax. And the prices can only go up for infused syrup. So this one is cinnamon and vanilla infused. I've had their bourbon and vanilla one. The prices just go up for what they can infuse in it. Now, one of the other biggest maple syrup suppliers is Vermont, the state in the United States, on the upper East Coast. They produce about 50% of all of the US's syrup. This is due to the area being part of what is known as the Maple Belt, the forest of maple trees that go through the area. So from Vermont all the way to Quebec, sort of like that. I will say Vermont maple syrup, in my opinion, is just not as good as Quebec syrup, but that may change because I will be moving to the East Coast this year. The indigenous people of the eastern woodlands in Canada harvested the maple sap before the arrival of the European settlers. When French settlers arrived, they learned how to tap the maple trees and reduce the sap to a syrup from the indigenous people and kind of stole the practice from the natives. Are we surprised? We shouldn't be. Canada has 10 provinces, which are basically like states. I have listed them on screen so I do not mispronounce them because that's my forte. But you probably are very familiar with Quebec and Ontario. Maple syrup is regulated very differently in each province. So in Ontario, where Toronto is located, any maple syrup being sold to the consumer or a retail outlet must be graded and classified by color by the producer themselves, okay? So let's say I make some cookies. I can classify them, tell you, oh, this one's really good. I use dark chocolate and this is how much I'm gonna price it. That's my own personal thing. So the producer, the packer, or the retailer have to determine that. But there's 3 different people that can do that. However, in Montreal, maple syrup is graded to establish its market value according to criteria determined by an agreement between the producers and the authorized buyers. So I can make these cookies, but my buyer can be like, oh, no, you didn't use dark chocolate, so I'm gonna pay less for that sort of thing. Also in Quebec, you have to have a specialized license in order to even be allowed to harvest the sweet substance. Then the farmers have to harvest the sap and put it into a reserve, which this whole video is about the reserve. In Quebec, maple syrup is regulated like weed is in the United States, which is the best analogy I can come up with. So for this analogy, the province in Canada, like I said, are like all the states in the US. The regulations regarding maple syrup is different from province to province. In some areas, you don't need a license to harvest sap and sell it. And in others, you are very highly regulated. And if you step a toe out of line, you're gonna be getting massive fines and maybe even jail time. So think of California, New Mexico, and Massachusetts. Weed is legal for everyone. You can do it, you can go buy it, there's stores set up for it. You're not gonna go to jail. But in Texas, my home state, weed is illegal completely. If you're caught with it, you're going to jail and you're getting a fine. Now in other states, none are coming to mind right now, you can buy weed, but you need a doctor's prescription, medical grade weed sort of thing. Now that we have all the background information on this case, let's get into how the heist actually happened. Several months between 2011 and 2012, a set of thieves stole over 2,700 tons of maple syrup, equating to 9,571 barrels and equaling a market value of $18.6 million in 2012 or $21.7 million in 2021 from one of the largest storage facilities in St. Louis de Blatford, Quebec. As I mentioned, Quebec is one of the largest producers of maple syrup, and in the province there is a ruling party called the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, or the FPAQ. Per their French pronunciation, that's where the initials come from, not from the English translation. It was thought to be an insider job of how the syrup disappeared, and someone part of the Federation must have had done it. In 1966, a small group of Quebec maple syrup producers created a plan to collect the market. This movement created the formation of a small agreement across all Quebec, which became known as the FPAQ. The Federation's goal was to maintain a strategic maple syrup reserve known as the International Strategic Reserve, or the ISR, across multiple warehouses located in multiple rural towns in Quebec. The main reason for the FPAQ formation was due to maple syrup being a seasonal harvest and production product that requires a secondary farming enterprise amongst Quebec farmers. The price you can charge for syrup depended on the quality, quantity, and timing of the harvest. Was it during the peak season or near the end of the season? Sort of like picking your produce when it's not in season. You're not going to get the best produce when, say, it's winter and you're buying strawberries, and strawberries are best during the summer when they are producing. And some seasons, trees didn't produce as much syrup. So they had to have a reserve because this is Canada's biggest moneymaker. This makes maple syrup economically harsh because there are way too many variables. It's not something that you can rely on. The FPAQ became a government-sanctioned regulator and soon changed its name to the Quebec Maple Syrup Producers. So the FPAQ, or the QMSP, created annual quotas for the producers and oversees the production and sale of all maple syrup products from Quebec. This hasn't really made producers the happiest because all their profits began to diminish. You You basically are forced to hand over your syrup to the FPAQ for a small profit, and then the Federation can sell it to whoever they want in the whole world wholesale. So in 2000, they started a strategic reserve in case of a short supply season, like I mentioned. Then in 2011, the reserve had filled up, creating such a large surplus, they decided to start storing barrels in a St. Louis de Blatford, Quebec warehouse. It took less than a year, but the new warehouse was storing a valued $30 million worth of maple syrup. This would be the Federation's downfall. On the morning of July 30th, 2012, the FPAQ hired an accountant to conduct an annual inspection of the syrup being stored at the warehouse, and this is the first time they had done it since they moved into this warehouse the previous year. The man's name was Michael Gariveau, and he pulled up to the brick warehouse 2 hours north of Montreal. The warehouse housed about 16,000 baby blue colored barrels, 1/10 of Quebec's annual production, stacked 6 rows high and hundreds of rows deep. Each individual barrel weighed about 620 pounds and required a specialized forklift to move them, each of them, every single one of them. As Michael was counting the barrels, one of the barrels almost fell over along with him. Now, obviously, a full barrel weighing 620 pounds would not fall over. That's practically impossible to move unless you are a bodybuilder or something. I know I could not tip over 620 pounds of weight. The inspector was dumbfounded because he then rattled the barrel, and then the barrel felt like it was empty, so he opened the lid, and what do you know? It was empty. Multiple other barrels were empty, and to make matters worse, some of the barrels were even filled with good old water. The inspector then notified the Federation leaders, who rushed over to the warehouse because syrup is missing, and the leaders noticed that multiple of the barrels were dirty, scuffed, and had dents with rust on them before they opened them to find that they were filled with H2O. All the characteristics were odd because the Federation only used brand new barrels to store their syrup, and they cleaned them before they put them in the reserve. So obviously maple syrup's sticky, and you can see like there's some leaked on the side here. They would clean it up before they would store it. So on the outside, it's pristine. Now, the biggest red flag, outlier, whatever you want to call it, was maple syrup does not oxidize, so it cannot rust. But you know what does rust? Water. This facility had no CCTV footage, so there was no evidence of a theft ever happening. But one thing was for certain. There was $18 million of maple syrup gone, vanished. The Federation immediately called the police, and the Serenity de Quebec police began investigating. It would take 2 months for them to calculate the amount of barrels that were fraudulent, and 60% of the stockpile was stolen and replaced. Somehow over 6 million pounds of syrup had been vanished, valued at over $18 million wholesale. So let's say that is 2 to 3 times more when you place it on the shelf. The SQ police could only come to one conclusion. This was an inside job. This wasn't a one-time thing. For one, the Federation had built a specialized crane outfitted to stack the barrels without denting them or scuffing them, but the ones that were placed were dented like the original forklift built for this wasn't used. It would have taken multiple trips over a year to move the barrels out, and it would have calculated to about 100 tractor-trailer sized trips in total. Someone within the Federation would have had to been the one to steal it. In a statement made by one of the acting directors of the Federation, Simon Trepanner, said, and I quote, "To steal the amount of maple syrup means you have to know the market. We are talking about big players here. The theft was a direct threat to the FPAQ. Someone who was viewing the growing strategic reserve as something that was as simple as stealing money from the producers. And they obviously had a black market buyer interested to purchase the syrup and took it off the thieves' hands." Now, the Quebec Maple Syrup Producers Federation was not widely appreciated by any means. Many producers saw the Federation as a legalized cartel backed by the government. It works just as you would imagine. The people with larger lands make more money, and those with just a couple maple trees don't make as much. One family, the Tricots, had a 12,000 tree-sized sugar bush located in Drummondville, Quebec. They obviously can produce more syrup, so they can sell more to the reserve. Syrup is tapped from the sprouts, linked to plastic tubes stretching between all the trees, leading to a vacuum pump in a wooden shack somewhere on these producers' property. Then a stainless steel Dalier evaporator boils the syrup till it reaches a concentration that is 66% sugar. Now it is ready to put in the barrels and store in a reserve. Say you want to become a maple syrup producer in Quebec. You have to either buy your land from someone who has been granted an allocation for the land containing maple syrup trees, or you have to apply for a new land grant allocating from Federation. Now, there's no time frame for how long this could take, but rather if you'll ever get approved to become a producer. There are currently 1,200 applicants on this list. This reminds me of the New York City taxi medallions, which can cost upwards of $600,000 to $1 million each just to become a city authorized taxi driver. Each producers are allowed to exceed the required quotas if they're able to every year, but they will only get paid once their syrup is exhausted by the Federation. Plus, they have to pay pay for storage of their own barrels. This can cause an oversight at times because it's exploitative. Let's say a producer doesn't meet their quotas put on them. The Federation Council could ask them to provide any personal bills, like an electricity bill, to prove that they weren't boiling the syrup and somehow hoarding that syrup. And not that, hey, maybe my trees just didn't produce as much syrup as I'm used to this year, which can happen. This creates a toxic relationship between producers and wholesale buyers when many farmers are hit with hefty fines. FPAQ took away direct consumer selling and put in regulations, so now producers would have to wait months to get paid, and they also have to pay 12 cents per pound sold, which during this time was you would sell a pound of maple syrup for $2. Think about working between February and April, peak syrup season, and then not getting paid for that work until December of that year. It's not a net 30, net 90, I'm working right now and I'll get paid for it in 2 weeks. It's not that. It's I'm working right now and I'm not going to see it till Christmas. And then remember, on top of that, you have to pay 12 cents per pound, and each barrel weighs 620 pounds, which means that is $74.40 per barrel, and you still have to pay on top of that income taxes and the storage fees forced upon you. When you go deeper, you learn that a lot of the Federation High Board members are also producers, and they are the ones often with the most land, like 1,200 trees, having the higher ability to overproduce their quota and make the most money. As I said, you only get paid once your barrels are sold. So say you're a high power person in the cartel, then hey, you can sell your barrels first and you can get paid first compared to, I don't know, let's say Sally, who owns maybe a small 36 tree sugar bush, and now she won't get paid because you've pushed your 1,200 sugar bush stock first. Now you don't have to pay the storage fee, but Sally does for who knows how long, and you got cashed out maybe in June, and she's not going to get paid till December. And on top of that, she's going to lose more money because all that time that her barrels were being stored. You see what I mean? Now you, 1,200 trees, can take that $75 fee per barrel better than Sally, who may only produce 5 barrels a year and has to maintain the farm and the equipment all year long. So now let's get back to the case. The Federation had been keeping a surplus in the St. Louis de Blanford warehouse where there was no CCTV footage, with only a security guard routinely stopping by during the week. Police knew that this was an inside job off the bat, so they decided to focus on individuals who had direct access to the warehouse. Between October of 2011, when the warehouse had begun to be used, and July of 2012, the mysterious groups of thieves were stealing syrup. It would be discovered that the original barrels would be taken out of the warehouse, emptied into the thief's own barrels in some sort of semi-truck, cleaned out, and then replaced with water and placed back into the warehouse, making it seem like nothing ever happened unless you expected the barrels and saw they were scruffed or tarnished or rusted. As time went on, it seemed like the thieves got a little lazier and stopped to fill the barrels with water and just kind of returned them empty. It took a while, but police were able to track down the band of thieves who committed the crime. In Nedgewick, New Brunswick, Canada, a logging town about 100 miles north of Maine and just east of Quebec, a 69-year-old man named Etienne St. Pierre was a widower. Post-retirement, Etienne decided to become a producer, but between 1993 and 1995, he kept losing his sales because buyers kept declaring bankruptcy, so he was producing 65,000 pounds a year, but he wasn't making money off of it. So Etienne decided to sell his sugar bush to his son and directly sell the syrup from his home office to some United States distributors and avoid the Federation as a whole. In 2002, he sold directly to Maple Grove Farms in Vermont, and by 2006, he was advertising to Quebec producers to sell to him because New Brunswick was another Canadian province, so they didn't have to adhere to the Quebec rules. And he guaranteed them 25 to 50% cash ASAP. Now, they were technically making less than the Federation would have paid them, but they were getting that money a lot quicker. So as you can probably guess, Etienne St. Pierre and his friends hated the Federation. After the Federation reported the theft, the SQ police interviewed over 300 people in the maple syrup industry, and they had export statistic experts, people who knew about export, conducted forensic analysis of the syrup kettles, looked into the specialized forklifts used in the warehouse, and the scales to weigh the syrup. Police used about 40 warrants in total during the whole investigation. Throughout a year-long investigation, the police were able to track 2/3 of the missing syrup to New Brunswick, Ontario, Vermont, and other parts of Quebec. Etienne St. Pierre would be the first person arrested in the scandal on September 25th, 2012, where with a search warrant, SQ police were able to find over $1 million worth of syrup stored in an unmarked warehouse. On his property, police would seize a forklift, a list of secret suppliers, and his own syrup for forensic testing. Now, Etienne ratted out his fellow thieves in less than 24 hours after being detained. He immediately gave the ringleader's name, where he got 700 to 800 of the barrels he was storing from. A man named Richard Valliere was known as one of Quebec's most notorious barrel rollers. Now, what's a barrel roller, you may be asking? Well, it's a common name for an unauthorized middleman man who ran illegal maple syrup warehouses not regulated by the Federation and owes thousands of dollars in fines. Richel had a hidden warehouse outside of Quebec City where 75 to 100 barrels were being stored. Neighbors would say that they could smell the maple syrup coming from the warehouse, so he wasn't really hiding it. It was in the plain sight. Now, Richel was in his 30s being arrested for shoplifting maple syrup, and he was arrested on December 18th, 2012 on charges of conspiring with 5 other people to commit theft at the warehouse and to sell the stolen maple syrup. As you can guess, Valère spilled his guts right away, claiming he learned of the reserve warehouse in St. Louis, but Lanford, Quebec, from a man named Avahi Kawan, whose wife was the co-owner of the warehouse and rented part of the warehouse himself to store his own syrup. The pair was the ones to come up with the plan. So the Federation was housing syrup in not even a private warehouse they were renting, not full private. There was other people storing other things in the same warehouse, and they would only authorize go in and audit it once a year. In total, 22 suspects would be arrested, all accused of knowingly housing the stolen syrup and trafficking the syrup to interested buyers. Etienne St. Pierre was released on bail and claimed he had nothing to do with that. The biggest concern, minus all the stolen syrup, was that it would hit the market and the quality would be off because the suppliers gave such a good deal that they were not going to want to buy a normal, not smuggled price. And then the quality, can they guarantee it? 70 truckloads of the 100 trucks were found to have been bought by some of the 3 largest US distributors. After this incident, the Federation moved all the syrup to a new warehouse in Laurierville, 25 miles north of this one in Saint-Debleuvac, Quebec. Now, Richel Valère, believed to be the mastermind of the heist, was sentenced to repaying the full $18 million valued amount of the stolen syrup. Not the profits that he made off of the syrup, no, full wholesale market value of it. All the stolen amount, and even though some of the maple syrup was recovered. In 2014, during a police interview, Richel finally admitted to participating in the black market selling of the maple syrup. For over a decade, they were stealing syrup from other places, even before this one. Now, all the thieves claim their innocence due to the FPAQ, supply management practices, being harsh and cruel to the producers. The thieves technically didn't do anything wrong, they were claiming, besides, the stealing. They sold the syrup from New Brunswick, which has no price and no production control rules. Only Quebec has those. Their buyers all came from referrals from Etienne. Out of the stolen 2,700 tons, 450 tons were recovered, and most were destroyed because they didn't know if it was still safe to consume for human, because were the barrels clean, were they housed properly at the right temperatures, so forth and so on. So I don't know how you destroy maple syrup, but they're gone. Now, of course, we've already talked about Richel Valère. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison as of April 2017, along with a $9.4 million fine on top of the repaying back $18 million he owes, and an additional 14 years in prison if he doesn't pay the money back during a certain time period. It's not looking good for him. So Richel's own father, Raymond Valère, was also convicted of housing the stolen syrup. He was sentenced to 2 years minus 1 day in jail, along with 3 additional years of probation for possession. Etienne St. Pierre, the reseller, was sentenced to 2 years minus 1 day in jail, along with 3 years of probation, along with having to pay an $850,000 fine. Avi Kouan, who we spoke about earlier, he's the man whose wife is technically the insider that gave him the information, who co-owns the FPAQ rented warehouse, was sentenced to 5 years in prison, along with having to pay a $1.2 million fine. Lastly, a man we didn't really talk about, but was Richel's best friend, named Sebastian Atrahad, was the semi-truck driver, basically driving the getaway car. He was sentenced to 8 months in prison, which, if you don't know, you need a CDL license in order to even operate an 18-wheel semi-truck, which is why Sebastian was sentenced to jail time, because he drove the car that was transporting the maple syrup. Now, there is a great documentary on Netflix in the series called Dirty Money. It is the first link under sources on this case, and it's one of my favorite white-collar series as a whole, but the episode on this is really interesting because it depicts the Federation side of the case and then a producer's side of the case and how they differ, and it interviews one woman who I cannot pronounce the name and how she's kind of been fighting the Federation and protesting against them her whole life. So if you want an even more personalized information documentary on it, I would go check that out. Apparently Amazon is developing a documentary on this too, but it's been years and no word of it. That is all the information I have on this case. I do want to give my quick opinion. I see both sides. I see why there needs to be a regulation of syrup, of your biggest export. And I understand why Quebec is so strict, because it is the one province in all of Canada that has the most trees. But I totally get why it's called a legalized cartel, because what do you mean I'm giving you something I'm working my behind off of producing, and I'm not going to get paid for 6 months? And then the people in the Federation also are producers, so I don't know if they're selling their syrup first. There's just so much oversight, and I understand why it's needed, but I also don't get why why it's the way it happens, I wouldn't be so confused and so critical if it was like the producers are farmers and they're having to sell their syrup to the agriculture part of the government, and the government is the one that houses it. What if someone in the Federation doesn't like you and they're rating your syrup not grade A, and now you're not getting as much money? I don't think the producers and Federation should both be the same people. I think there needs to be an oversight. Yeah, it's just like if I were to wholesale, again, that cookie analogy, if I were to make cookies and then just like sell them, I don't know, to a local cafe, the cafe can decide how to price them, and I sold them to a wholesale. But the cafe cannot tell me, oh, you can't price them like that. It just, I don't even know if that makes sense, but that's where I'm going, you know? I guess it would be like, I can't tell another person they're buying baked goods from, like, oh, you can't price it like that. No, because that's not quality. What right do I have? We're both bakers, you know? I don't get that. So let me know your opinions on this case down below. It's fascinating because no one got hurt. They discovered most of the maple syrup, and as far as I'm concerned, none of the maple syrup sold in the US did anything. It was perfectly fine, perfectly safe. Maple syrup is one of those things where it's like, you would know if it tastes off. I also don't know what like food laws are in Canada, because y'all have milk in a bag over there. How does that even work? I know how it works, but like, why do you sell it like that? We don't sell any liquids in bags in the States. Hopefully this was a lighthearted case. The next couple ones are not going to be lighthearted. So we needed a little palate cleanser, if you will. My socials are linked down below. Follow me if you want. I've been posting a lot more on Instagram and TikTok. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. A lot of exciting content is coming. As always, the palette cleanser, the doggo picture of the day is this picture of Ginger, because she's been here the whole time with us, hiding in the pillows. The dogs love the pillows so much. I don't know if you can even see her. Nova's hiding behind a squishy. Love you, mean it, kisses, don't think stupid, and I'll see you next time. Bye!